Welcome to today's virtual event on the interplay between food security and national security. I'm Eugene Scott, senior politics reporter at Axios, and I'm coming to you today from Washington, D.C. Welcome to our audiences on Facebook, YouTube, X, LinkedIn, and on Axios.com. Join the conversation today on X with @Axios and #Axios events. During today's event on World Food Day, we'll be looking at the intersections between food security and national security in the face of today's global challenges. Our first guest is California Congresswoman Sydney Kamlager-Dove, joining us today from Washington, D.C. Hi, Congresswoman. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing well. Are you doing well?
I'm wishing we could pick a speaker so we could get on with the business of Congress, which also includes making sure that we're passing our farm bill and our ag bill so that we can feed the country and the world.
I am hoping that we can pick a speaker as well. I think I have an idea who you believe the speaker should be, and I'm going to let you articulate that at another time. But right now, I do want to hear your thoughts on the Farm Bill since you brought it up. Why is it so important in a moment like now that that legislation be passed?
Well, I think that, food hunger is probably the worst weapon of mass destruction. And it's a weapon that we are utilizing here against the poor, against our seniors, against our children. And it's also a weapon that is being used to ravage parts of Central and Latin America and countries within Africa. I think we have an obligation as a democracy to upstand prevention methods that will allow us to feed the hungry and children and the sick and seniors. And we have an obligation to share what we have with partners and allies around the world.
And so can you tell us a bit about your story in terms of how did food security become a passion project for you?
Well, I did not grow up with a lot of money. I remember the days when, my mom would get food stamps and she would ration out the food that we would get. I mean, I certainly remember going to my grandmother's house and we had, WIC sanctioned cereal and government cheese. And you think that's what every family is dealing with, making sure that they have enough food to feed, everyone in the household. Fast forward to now, we're dealing with a homelessness crisis in my district in the state of California, which is also complemented by hunger. People every day are figuring out how they're going to eat, how they're going to put some food in their bellies. And we know that many adults, many parents are going without food so that their children can eat. In my district, 1 in 5 go hungry, but 1 in 3 children go hungry. I've toured the food banks in my district, and they are doing tens of thousands of meals on a daily basis to address the food hunger that's in Los Angeles, one of the most populous cities and counties in the world. I've also had the opportunity to travel to other countries, mostly countries in Africa, and have also seen the devastation of, acute child malnutrition and acute malnutrition for adults as well. And it's something that can be easily solved, and it's something that we should never ignore.
So you mentioned a lot there that I think is of interest to our listeners, especially those stats about 1 in 5 and 1 in 3 children. And I know it's not an either or, but what would you say to people who wonder why the U.S. spends so much effort and time and energy and resources addressing food insecurity globally, given the issues we have in the States?
Well, I think food hunger is one of the reasons for conflict. There's a fight over natural resources like water, like land. And that when those things are in conflict with one another, when countries are in conflict with one another, or tribes, communities, et cetera, I think that drives up hunger because people ultimately are moving to where there's access to resources. When that happens in hotspots around the world, it's also complicated with issues around sort of, ethnic identity, access to power, and that can cause challenges to national security as well. So I think we should not be looking at things in silos. We should be thinking, well, if these countries in other parts of the world have the resources, have the support from us to address issues like acute poverty and child malnutrition, then maybe that will tamp down on some of the ethnic conflict or religious conflict or political conflict that they're facing. And ultimately, I think we do want to have, a world where we see more peace than war.
We can't have this conversation with the issues you just surfaced without discussing to some degree the Israeli-Hamas conflict right now. And we have recent reports saying the United Nations has called for humanitarian aid in Gaza, giving pressure to evacuate the region. At least 1 million individuals, many of these individuals' children, are fleeing their home. And with that being said, perhaps obviously food insecurity is going to be a real concern for these individuals. What would you say to individuals who may not know much about conflict, which you mentioned earlier, and the role that food insecurity plays in the challenges of those moments and the difficulties of those moments as people are looking for safety?
Well, I think it's incredibly important that the international community, in conjunction with the United Nations, continues to put pressure on to make sure that food, water, and electricity are available to those in Gaza. There are innocent folks caught in the midst of this war between terrorist Hamas and the Israeli government. And, many of those folks are women and children, and they should have access to food and clean water. When I went to Kenya, we visited a number of refugee camps, and we visited some healthcare centers. And I talked to a number of folks from Somalia who had found their way to Kenya for refuge. And what we talked about was food insecurity, families rushing because of conflict to get someplace safe where they could eat. And oftentimes we forget about the children and the women who are brutalized and really sort of left for dead. Oftentimes they are, if they're not the breadwinners, they're the ones upstanding that particular family. And they are struggling to provide and stay alive. That's what happens in war, which we don't think about. So we've had these folks coming into Kenya, having to find a way to live in a strange land. And then we also talked to Kenyans who were suffering also because of conflict and poverty. And they're having to figure out, how to move from a pastoral living arrangement to agriculture, right? And this is something that's foreign to them. And how do they manage? How do they eat? How do they grow food that they can sell so that they can survive? And how do they negotiate with their neighbors about around a finite number of natural resources that are available to them? And so you don't really think about that. And then in the midst of all this, I had an opportunity to look at the food that was available to folks in the refugee camps. And a lot of it was food coming from the United States and other countries. And they're rationing. So I actually was able to look at, it was like a 5-gallon bucket of grain that had to feed a family of 4 for a month. When you think about it and you looked at what that looked like, it's not a lot. And because of the war in Ukraine, that bucket was actually getting smaller and smaller in terms of, how it was going to be dispersed because the war impacts supply chain. And supply chain is about how much food you're able to get from point A to point B. So I do hope that when we're thinking about war and when we're talking about conflicts, we should also be inserting food and access to food in all of those discussions.
I appreciate you adding that perspective. I want to bring things back a bit to the States. When we talk about food insecurity in adults, I think often people have an idea about what individuals who don't have access to food look like. They see, homeless people on the street. But from what I've researched, that's not what is always the case. Can you provide some more insight into who is, struggling in our communities with food exactly?
Everyone is struggling. As I mentioned, I toured the food bank. I went to visit a farmer's market. I went to a WIC facility. And hunger cuts across the entire spectrum. You're looking at seniors who are on fixed income, who are, figuring out how many oranges they can eat a day. Can I only eat one orange? Can I eat two? Is that the dinner? Is that the lunch? Where am I going to get my protein? How am I managing? And how far do I have to go to get to either a food bank or a church that is delivering the food or has the food available for me? And then you're talking about children. As I mentioned, 1 in 3 in my district are suffering from food hunger. And how does that materialize? How is that impacting them when they're going to school, when they're leaving school and going home? Are we filling them up on junk food? Or are we trying to make sure that they have access to, healthy foods? Then you talk about newborn babies. And so now we have a situation because the Ag Bill and the Farm Bill haven't been reauthorized, and because we don't have a functioning government right now, where Republicans are talking about cutting WIC. So right now, newborn mothers have $49 a month, and Republicans have proposed to cut it down to $11 a month to feed a newborn baby. What does that look like? And we're talking about cutting food for peace by 70%, which is international, not national, like the question that you're, asking me about. But all of these things come into play because they're pressures that compound. And if a farmer is not able to grow the food that they need to grow to sell, that impacts their livelihood and their community. And it also impacts the folks that are trying to buy their food. And many of those folks are in my district.
Well, there's so much there, and hopefully we can get you back later in the year to talk to us about this more, especially if this legislation actually gets passed. I want to thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for the opportunity.
And next, we're going to have a view from the top.
Hey, thanks, Eugene, and welcome, everybody. I'm Chris Freitz. I want to thank you for joining us this afternoon, and I want to thank our sponsor, World Food Program USA, for making this conversation possible. And joining me now from World Food Program USA is Chase Sova. He's the Senior Director of Public Policy and Research. Chase, welcome to Axios.
Chris, good to be here. Thanks for having me today.
So I'm really excited to talk with you about this because I think when a lot of people, myself included, think about food insecurity, we think about it largely as a social issue, but it's also a national security issue, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about, and that the World Food Program USA has been thinking about in recent years. So let me just mention one thing. The World Food Program USA is a Washington, D.C. based nonprofit organization that supports the mission of the United Nations World Food Program here in the United States. And a big part of that is educating lawmakers. And that's really what I do in my day-to-day. But let's talk a little bit about this linkage, because it's an important question. Throughout history, as we think about conflict events, war and conflict events, the inevitable outcome of every single one of those issues that we face is poverty and food insecurity. But I think that we're starting to learn a little bit more about how that relationship works in the inverse as well. The ways that food insecurity itself is driving global instability. It's a really vicious feedback loop, Chris, that we're spending more and more time thinking about. Now, I remember early on when I started working up on Capitol Hill, Senator Pat Roberts saying things like, "Show me a nation that can't feed itself, and I'll show you a nation in chaos." And I remember hearing folks like Senator Lindsey Graham say, "Feed them now or fight them later," right? So there was always this sort of anecdotal understanding of the relationship between food insecurity and global instability. But what I've spent a little time working on in the last 5 years is a report called Dangerously Hungry, the Link Between Food Insecurity and Instability. And the idea there was to take what we know to be anecdotally true and sort of back that up with an evidence base. And what we found digging really deep into the literature on this topic is that one of the greatest threats to global instability is failing to feed someone who cannot feed themselves and their family. Because food insecurity has this way of driving people into violent extremism. It causes them to riot and protest. It forces people into competition over scarce natural resources. And it's, of course, a major source of migration around the planet. So this is a really important topic. The one thing I do want to mention at the end of this, before we move on, is that food insecurity itself is almost never the sole driver of conflict around the planet, right? There always has to be some sort of individual motivator combined with that allows, forces people to choose conflict over peace. And sometimes that's exploitation. It's an opportunity cost. Does engaging in conflict provide more of a benefit than the alternative, which is peace? Is it grievance? Sometimes food insecurity is the straw that breaks the camel's back in conflicts where people around the planet have already experienced violence. And one of the greatest predictors of violence in a country is a history of it. And then there's also this question of governance, which we can get into maybe later. But I think governance is another piece of this. When people have lost trust or government does not intervene to prevent food instability or food insecurity, or fails to do so, that can lead to mistrust and cause this relationship to sort of compound on itself.
So there's a lot there, and I just wonder, what do you find? Do American lawmakers appreciate this link between the national security implications of global food insecurity?
Well, I think, Chris, we're heading in that direction. I think we made a lot of progress on this front. When you think about historical support for international food assistance accounts, when you think about why lawmakers care about organizations like the World Food Program, it's typically coming from one of three places, right? It's either morally right, represents what's best about the American people. We have a long legacy in leading the global community through global hunger crises. It might be economic, right? Sometimes lawmakers see this as an opportunity to open up markets for American goods and consumers. Helping a country get back on their feet allows them to trade with the United States in the long run. But increasingly, this national security element, it's sort of a three-legged stool if you think about it in that way. This national security element, I think, is growing in importance. And it's growing in part because of the events of Russia and Ukraine over the last year. Right? When we saw Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there was an immediate increase in global food prices. There were at least 10,000 individual protest events over the last year, resulting from a rise in food and fuel prices. So yes, I think lawmakers are starting to care more about this. We've seen work at the UN Security Council condemning the use of food as a weapon of war. We've seen similar bills taken up in the House and Senate. So, we've come a long way from the early anecdotal evidence and quotes from Senator Graham and Pat Roberts to where we are now.
Right. So then the question being, if there's some more awareness, what can we do to cut that link between food insecurity and instability?
Yeah, I think, Chris, this is all about changing the calculus in somebody's life, right? If somebody is experiencing tremendous food insecurity, life-threatening food insecurity, we have to figure out a way to intervene before it metastasizes into something greater, right? And very often, when we fail to intervene, we end up spending more in both blood and treasure to intervene down the road militarily or otherwise. And so we need to start funding these programs with a lot more ambition than we are right now. And I think that's really, really critical. The World Food Program is the biggest partner of the United States government in delivering international food assistance. And we're looking at funding deficits this year of about 60%. We're cutting rations in half of our programs around the world. So we know the solution to this, Chris. We just need to put more dollars behind the problem.
All right, well, I think we have to leave it there. Chase Silva is the Senior Director of Public Policy and Research for World Food Program USA. Chase, thanks so much for joining Axios.
Thanks, Chris.
And now over to Nyla Boodoo.
Thanks, Chris. Our final guest today is the Director of the Global Food and Water Security Program at CSIS, Caitlin Welsh, joining us from Washington, D.C. Caitlin, thanks for being with us today.
Nyla, thanks for inviting me.
I've heard you talk about the 3 Cs when it comes to food insecurity. So I wanted to focus on that: COVID, climate, and conflict. And I thought we should start with the current global conflict in Israel and the West Bank. As I was preparing to talk to you this conversation, I got an alert on my phone about Israel cutting off supplies of food, fuel, water, and goods to Gaza. And unfortunately, I think cutting people off from food and water is as old as war itself. Have we forgotten that?
I don't think that we've forgotten that. And I think that you're exactly right that food as a weapon in conflict is as old as conflict, it's as old as time. We have seen announcements that Israel cutting off food, fuel, and energy from the Gaza Strip is a main part of its tactic in retaliation for Hamas's massacre last week. But around the world, it's not the only place that we see food used as a tool in war. Beyond this instance that's very current in the past week, we've seen Russia using food and agriculture as a major tool in its war in Ukraine ever since it invaded last year.
Right. And in fact, they've publicly said this. Russian officials have said food is our silent weapon, silent but formidable. Ironically, that was said on Telegram, so not so silent. But yes, as we think about Ukraine, realistically, first, I just wanted to ask you about the grain deal that had existed. Is there any chance that that would be revived, that you see that being revived?
I don't necessarily see that being revived because I see that Russia envisions its absence from this deal and Ukraine's lack of access to its Black Sea ports solely in Russia's interest, in Russia's political and economic and strategic interest in the context of this war. What do I mean by that? I mean that when Ukraine cannot access the main ports that it was using to export its agricultural goods, it's bad for Ukraine's economy. We've seen agriculture's contribution to Ukraine's GDP falling since Russia invaded. We see that it's good for Russia in the sense that it's sowing discord among EU member states as Ukraine is pushing its exports through its neighboring countries. There's disagreement about that's playing out in real time, both in Ukraine's relations with these countries, within the EU, and also within the WTO. So Russia sees that as in its interest because it threatens EU unity, unified EU support for Ukraine right now. And finally, the less Ukraine is able to access its ports on the Black Sea, the less Ukraine is able to export generally. And the better it is for Russia, because Russia happened to have had a bumper year, an excellent year for its own harvest. Russia is predicted to export not only a record amount of wheat for Russia, but a world record amount of wheat this year, which Russia can then use to appease countries that are protesting Russia's backing out of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. And we've seen that in Russia offering low cost and free grain to food importing countries, again, to appease these countries who would be opposing Russia otherwise.
Given that, what kind of effect do we think that will have on the overall grain market and food prices after a couple, and I want to get into this in a moment, just sort of the couple years of massive volatility we've seen on that?
Yeah, so right now, in large part because of Russia's enormous harvest this year, global grain prices have been falling. Two main effects I do see, though, are that Ukraine's own harvest is set to be exported in the coming months. It harvests its crops in around the summertime and fall, and exports in November, December, January, around those months. And so we could see an increased impact of Ukraine's lack of access to its Black Sea ports as the months go on, when it would be set to export the most of its goods in any case. And second of all, in case of another shock, be it a climate-related shock in a producing country, a political induced shock like India's imposing of its export ban on its rice exports. If we see shocks in agriculture markets otherwise, taking Ukraine out of the equation simply it removes a buffer that's very, very important. Again, because global markets are susceptible, as we've seen over the past several years, very clearly susceptible to supply shocks, demand shocks, climate and weather-related production shocks, political shocks, and others. And we really can't afford to lose a buffer the size of Ukraine.
Can you share a little bit about that buffer, but also just how important that is given the current situation with supply chain? Have we gotten over the big pre-existing problems that we had from COVID? Have those mostly stabilized?
Yeah, a great way to segue. So, but in terms of Ukraine as a buffer, Ukraine is a major producer and exporter of numerous agricultural commodities: wheat, maize, soybean, sunflower oil, barley, and others. So it's a major producer, a major player, and has become that way over the past several decades. When it comes to supply chain shocks due to the COVID pandemic, that's another C that we talk about, as you mentioned, conflict, COVID, and climate as some of the major factors affecting food insecurity around the world. When it comes to COVID, it is certainly supply and demand shocks happening all over the world at various times, including recently in China. But markets are settling out, and yet the UN Food and Agriculture Organization is still predicting that COVID will be affecting food security around the world by 2030. So whereas markets are settling out, we're going to see long-term impacts of COVID on food insecurity around the world.
I want to end on talking about the final C, which is the other long-term impact, climate change. And I think the really practical example of this, I'm hoping we could zero in on it, is in Yemen. The Washington Post was just recently reporting on hospitals they visited in Yemen, saying that summer heat had increased their caseload of malnourished children by 10% or more. I thought it was interesting that the World Health Organization in Yemen says the agency hasn't yet established a causal relationship between climate change and undernourishment. Can you explain what we're seeing in places like Yemen right now, which of course are also not immune to the other C, right? The conflict part of this.
Absolutely. I mean, we would normally refer to Yemen as unfortunately, a case study of the impacts of conflict on food insecurity. It's one of the food insecurity hotspots around the world, mainly for that reason. There are many links between climate change and food insecurity and malnutrition. I can wager some guesses to what we're seeing in Yemen right now, but just to take a broader picture, often we can oversimplify this into the impacts of climate change on agricultural production, simply because it's very easy to visualize the impacts of droughts or floods or plant pests and diseases on agricultural output. It's not that simple, though. There's also the impacts of climate change on food systems generally, on the infrastructure that food systems rely on for storage and transportation and marketing. Those things can be affected by climate change, also affecting food insecurity for populations. Finally, climate change affects livelihoods, and I'm guessing that is a major factor in what we're seeing in Yemen right now. Climate change can affect a family's livelihood when that family is engaged in agriculture and relies on agriculture for its livelihood. Climate impacts can therefore affect that family's source of income. Beyond that, though, we're seeing very recently evidence that extreme heat also affects families' incomes, their wages, and therefore their food security, even when they're not directly involved in agriculture for their livelihoods. Imagine people who work at construction sites or other places where they rely on, where they must work outside and they get their wages day by day. In those families too, we're seeing a direct correlation between extreme heat and that family's ability to access food and nutrition, which can also affect nutrition among children first and foremost.
As we end here, I just wanted to ask you one last question. As we've talked about these three C's, right? There's COVID, climate, and conflict. How are you thinking about this going forward? What, in terms of what's next? Which one of these is worse, or all three of them equally bad here?
It's not necessarily an either or. They all interact. These three C's, and there are others. I mean, it's a quick way for us to be able to conceptualize the main drivers of food insecurity. Also, it's loss of wages and incomes related to all of these things. Many other factors influence food insecurity, but one way that I think about this going forward is that there will continue to be shocks related to all of these things. Just in the last several years, in the last 3.5 years, we've seen all of these playing out in major ways around the world. A pandemic that we predicted but still didn't expect. Climate shocks happening all over the world. Conflict rearing its head regularly and in unexpected ways. So they will continue to happen and continue to affect food insecurity around the world.
Caitlin Welsh, Director of Global Food and Water Security Program at CSIS. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us this afternoon on World Food Day for another Axios event that I hope has made you smarter, faster. For more coverage or to sign up for any of our Axios newsletters, you can visit axios.com/newsletters or on the Axios app. Thanks to all of you for joining, and we'll see you on axios.com.